Welcome. Welcome to Refill 100. Today, we have a very special program for you with a very special speaker. I encourage you to watch the video from beginning to end. Enjoy the learning. Let us start.
Hello, everyone. It is an honor to be here introducing our guest speaker, Ms. Caroline Lucas. Ms. Lucas is a British author and politician on topics such as green economics, alternatives to globalization, animal welfare, and much more. She's been a member of Parliament for the Brighton Pavilion constituency and has been since 2010. She has twice led the Green Party of England and Wales, winning her initial election with a majority vote of 92%. Let's just say I feel bad for the other guy. Not only is she a politician, but she's also an author and has written the book Honourable Friends about her first term in Parliament, and she's even co-edited The Alternative, which is about cross-party working. What you're hearing from me is that she's an extremely accomplished person, and I cannot wait to hear what she has to say. Please welcome Ms. Caroline Lucas.
Well, thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for coming out on a Friday evening to talk about the fate of the Earth and what we're going to do about it. So I'm really grateful that you're here, and I'm very privileged to have been asked to speak tonight. I was asked to speak about the key environmental challenges facing the world today. But I'm concerned that if I were to do that, then we might well be here all night and well into the weekend as well. Whether that's the accelerating deforestation, for example, which is leading to an area the size of 300 football fields being cut down every single hour. Or whether it's the 14 million tons of plastic pollution that make their way into our oceans every year. Whether it's the air pollution, which is implicated in the premature deaths of up to 7 million people globally each year. Or the annual erosion of nearly 70 billion tons of topsoil at a rate 100 times faster than it can be naturally replenished. Well, I don't know about you, but when I hear all those figures, my head starts to spin, and particularly when they have so many zeros at the end of them, then it's really hard to take in what we're talking about here. So let me just summarize by saying that globally we know that 1 million plant and animal species are at risk of extinction. We know that despite warm words and plentiful promises from governments, that we are nowhere near on track to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. Instead, as the UN Secretary General has recently warned, we are, in his words, on a fast track to climate disaster. And so in the interest of ensuring that we can all get away before midnight, I have narrowed down the task in front of me, and I'll focus on just two things. What is it, first of all, that is driving this reckless approach to our one fragile planetary home, of which the heating climate, the rising pollution, the accelerating deforestation are just the symptoms? And secondly, knowing what we know about the damage that we're causing, what stops us from acting at the speed and scale required to reverse it? So on that latter point first, I was hoping you might indulge me if I read from a collection called Letters to the Earth, which is here, that it was a collection that's been edited by the actor Emma Thompson, and basically people were invited to write letters either to the Earth or about the Earth. And I wrote mine, perhaps slightly strangely, to the arts community, because frankly, I think politics has failed. And let me just read this brief letter, which I think will set the context for this evening. It's called A Failure of Imagination. Dear artists and writers and poets and musicians, I'm writing to ask if you will help us. Will you help us protect this precious earth, to inspire us to believe that it's not too late to act, to show us that each and every one of us can make a difference, and to convince us that the system can still be changed? I ask this of you because I recognise that politics has failed. As a politician myself, that's not an easy thing to admit. But I know that even those politicians who do understand the urgency of making the transition to a zero carbon economy have not succeeded in persuading parliaments around the world to act with the speed and determination that's necessary. In our obsession with policies and procedures and parts per million, we've appealed to the heads, but have failed to touch the hearts of the people we represent. Yet the overwhelming question we face today is one that needs not only an intellectual response, but an emotional one as well. Why didn't we save ourselves when we had the chance? Those words, that question, quite literally haunts me. I wake up in the night with those words going round and round in my brain. 10 simple words that are spoken actually by the late, great Pete Postlethwaite, an actor who was the key person in a wonderful film called The Age of Stupid. He plays one of the few survivors of climate catastrophe, and it's a film based in 2055. And the film has him looking back at reels of television footage, real footage from weather events from the last few years, the typhoons in the Philippines, the heat waves in Australia, the freezing temperatures in the US, and he poses that simple question. Why didn't we save ourselves when we had the chance? And quite literally the hairs go up on the back of my neck. It is the most important question of our time. Why is it that we seem to be content to be the species that spent all its time monitoring its own extinction and its willful and knowing destruction of its own fragile and precious home, rather than taking steps to avoid it? Now, many reasons have been suggested. The power and vested interest of the fossil fuel companies, for example, who are increasingly not simply lobbying governments, but being given senior roles within it. Or that people are just too busy trying to get by, trying to cope with the latest obscenity from a leadership intent on making the poorest and most vulnerable pay the highest price for an economic crisis not of their making. Or that we're being bombarded by thousands of advertisements each day, all of them persuading us to go out and consume more, to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last. But more than any of these, I think, what stops us from acting is the fact that we rarely have the courage to emotionally connect with the reality of what we're doing to this one beautiful and precious earth. Academically, theoretically, we know about the dangers of exceeding 1.5 degrees of heating. But one of the reasons we don't internalize the reality of that, I think, is that we fear the darkness that might engulf us if we do. How do we cope with the thought that humanity might not wake up in time, that climate change might become irreversible, that societies, even in the developed world, might no longer have the ability to respond or cope? How do young people in particular deal with the reality that their parents' generation, frankly, friends, us, have brought this earth close to collapse? When we really connect and feel the reality of what we're doing, such feelings of powerlessness or of despair can be difficult to escape. And that is why we need your help. We need you to paint the positive pictures of how the world could be, and to tell us the vivid and compelling stories that show us that when people come together and act, there is always hope. We need you to remind us that human beings are endlessly caring and creative and innovative, and that if we choose to, we can set our minds to anything. We despair when we have no stories to describe the present and shape the future. In that respect, political failure is at root a failure of imagination. But with your help, we can rekindle our imagination and rediscover the power to act. So, I want to go back to that question. The question that Pete Postlethwaite poses in The Age of Stupid: why didn't we save ourselves when we had the chance? And while I do think that it is partly that we can't bear to spend too much time imagining, too much time living and thinking about the horror of what climate catastrophe really looks like, that terrifying reality that we are leaving our children, I believe it's also because we can't quite imagine what the alternative to the status quo looks like. In that famous saying, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? With all the warning lights on the dashboard flashing red, why are we still hurtling towards environmental breakdown? And the case I want to make tonight is that one of the main reasons is because our political leaders are still wedded to a dangerous and outdated economic system, one that is designed for growth and profit at all costs and based on the exploitation of people and planet alike. I'd argue that the climate and nature crises are an inescapable feature rather than an accidental fault of this system, and that our current economic model legitimizes greed, it promotes overconsumption, and it lauds limitless growth. It's one which protects immediate gratification and business as usual over and above a safe planet where all can thrive. You know, when I think about it, a dysfunctional economy is at the root of almost every environmental campaign I can think of, whether that is about plastic pollution or about overfishing or about deforestation or pesticides or climate breakdown. Yet until very recently, those of us who risk challenging this economic model, anyone who does dare to imagine an alternative to business as usual, has generally been given short shrift. In the UK, there's a fantastic professor called Professor Tim Jackson, who's written very widely on this subject. And as he says, questioning growth is deemed to be the act of lunatics, idealists, and revolutionaries, but question it we must. Because while governments, I accept, are finally understanding some of the arguments in favour of efficiency, in other words, using resources better and not wasting so much, I don't believe there is a government in the world that is planning to restrict economic activity to a level that the planet can sustain. Instead, they indulge in a fantasy of wishful thinking, that somehow some kind of technological fix is going to come along and get us out of the mess that we have created. But you know, it is precisely over-reliance on unproven new technologies that is leading us to delay the dramatic reduction in the emissions that need to happen right now, and is creating that dangerous cycle of future promises based on, frankly, no real substance and certainly no guarantee of success. Essentially, what we're doing is gambling the future of humanity and the rest of life on Earth because of this assumption that GDP must continue to grow in rich countries. You may know the fantastic journalist George Monbiot. As he has put it, for most mainstream economists, the living planet is an afterthought or maybe just a prayer. And in his words, the prayer goes something like this: Dear God, invisible hand, spirit of Friedrich Hayek, may our quest for endless economic growth somehow coexist with a viable future for our world's living systems and the people who depend on them. We have no idea how this might happen, but the economy works in mysterious ways. Amen. The bottom line is that we need to redesign the economy. We need to put the health and well-being of people and planet first. We need new economic goals, and we need them fast. To mix my metaphors, if we do not confront this economic elephant in the room, then we'll continue with a game of environmental whack-a-mole. In other words, we are chasing all the symptoms of this rotten, dysfunctional economic system, but we're not addressing the cause. And if we carry on like that, frankly, we will lose. Now, I accept that these ideas are not new. In the late noughties, for example, a major global commission was created by the French President Sarkozy, and it found that governments needed to, and I quote, shift emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being. Even longer ago, 50 years ago, in 1972, a team of scientists from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology decided to study the risks of civilizational collapse. Their model was the basis of the Club of Rome's famous Limits to Growth report. And they predicted that industrial civilization was on track to collapse sometime within the 21st century due to the exploitation of planetary resources. Now, they didn't get every detail right, but their overall warnings are proving to be alarmingly accurate. Last summer, an analysis from KPMG reran that MIT Limits to Growth model, and they concluded, almost 50 years on, that we are right on schedule in terms of what was predicted 50 years ago. Today, the case is stark. Even if you only look at, for for example, greenhouse gases, just one of the 9 planetary boundaries that we overshoot at our peril. Because as we approach the next big global climate talks, COP27, in Egypt later this year, it is clearer than ever that the pursuit of endless economic growth is literally devouring our efforts to decarbonize our economies. By that I mean, if you consider the fact that countries around the world are being tasked with coming up with programs and domestic plans to cut their emissions to net zero by the middle of the century, by 2050. But during that very same period, the next 30 years, the global economy is due to treble in size. That means 3 times more production and consumption that we're already doing each year. Now, it is hard enough to decarbonize the existing global economy in such a short time scale. The idea that we're going to be able to do that 3 times over, I would argue, is pretty much impossible. Because if we carry on with growth as usual, then cutting emissions in half by 2030 would require that we decarbonise the economy at a rate of 12% a year. That is 5 times faster than the historic rate of decarbonisation, 3 times faster than what scientists project as possible, even under highly optimistic conditions. Now, at this point, what normally happens is that someone will put up their hand and say, yes, but what about decoupling production from emissions? How do we become much more efficient so that just because we're producing more and more, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are more and more emissions associated with that production? I would argue that however heroic your assumptions are about the potential for decoupling growth from carbon emissions, there is no evidence that it can be absolute coupling rather than relative decoupling, and no evidence that it can happen in a fast enough time frame. So to take an example, you will often hear aviation bosses extolling the virtues of more efficient aeroplane engines that use less kerosene. But if the aviation sector as a whole is planning on continuing its extraordinary growth rates, then those efficiencies will soon be undercut by the sheer increase of the number of planes in the sky, even if each one of them is using that kerosene more efficiently. So let's just stop and ponder for a moment what exponential growth really means. Say we try to achieve the aims of bodies like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, who still seem to think that it's quite logical for us to achieve a 3% global growth rate, 3% global growth a year. That means that all of the environmental activity and economic problems that you're seeing now, all of that economic activity that we're seeing today, and the damage that it causes doubles in just 24 years. In other words, by 2046. Then it doubles again by 2070, and then again by 2094. Again, as Monbiot points out, it's like the Gemino curse in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, which multiplies the treasure in the Lestrange vault until it threatens to basically crush Harry and his friends to death. All the environmental crises we seek to avert today become twice as hard to address as global economic activity doubles and doubles again and doubles again. So little wonder then that more and more people are calling out the unsustainability of this approach, or that ever more expert bodies are speaking out on the need to reorient economies towards well-being instead of growth, and in ever stronger language. The UN Climate Change Committee has put forward a report called 10 New Insights in Climate Science. It was published last year. What they say is, and I quote, "Economic stimulus to focus primarily on growth would jeopardize the Paris Climate Agreement and thereby also threaten long-term social and economic prosperity." Or the World Health Organization, which has concluded that, and I quote, "By transitioning towards a well-being economy, financial systems would be redirected to prioritize human needs rather than unsustainable economic growth." And indeed, in a special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's foremost climate scientists, they do actually set out one lifeline scenario that does not rely on speculative and harmful negative emission technologies in order to keep global heating to 1.5 degrees. And that scenario basically is our emergency exit from climate breakdown. So what does it look like? Well, essentially, it's about scaling down material consumption by 20% globally with rich countries obviously leading the way. There are lots of debates to be had about how we do that, how to shift to a circular economy based on reuse and recycling in a way that is fair and just. How we would introduce, for example, a Green New Deal, which would see us rapidly and drastically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, diversify our food system so that it's fairer and more resilient, and put in place what's called a just transition for those working in sectors of the economy that are no longer sustainable. But frankly, it's next to impossible to even start having that conversation for as long as the be-all and end-all of every economy in the world is growth at all costs. Take the Chancellor in Britain today. I don't know if any of you have had the chance to look at the news today. You'll see that the pound is now at its lowest level against the dollar since, I think, 1985. That is thanks to our wonderful Chancellor, who has just announced what he called a fiscal event. He can't call it a budget, because if he calls it a budget, that means that the Office of Budget Responsibility, the government watchdog, has a right to scrutinise it and tell us whether or not the numbers add up. He doesn't call it a budget, he calls it a fiscal event, so he therefore evades scrutiny. More seriously, what he does is he stands up for half an hour and he mentions the word growth 24 times in 30 minutes, and just for the record, mentions climate and nature not one single time. Maybe in questions afterwards we can go into exactly what he did in that 30 minutes, because it was pretty damaging, I would argue. But the bottom line is that governments around the world are, generally speaking, obsessed with GDP, with gross domestic product. Every quarter in the UK, our Treasury reports on the levels of GDP. Every quarter, I can promise you, the Treasury does not report on levels of greenhouse gas emissions, of material consumption, of the state of nature, or inequality, or mental health, for example. This obsession with GDP as the sole indicator of progress is a massive problem for people and for nature, because GDP simply measures the size of a country's economy. How much is produced, how much is earned, how much is spent on goods and services. But in measuring the monetary value of economic activity, GDP makes no distinction between things that are good for us and those that are bad, those that detract from our quality of life. So war and pollution and crime and traffic accidents and the destruction of nature all have an amazingly positive impact on GDP. Yet they can hardly be seriously said to be signs of economic success. Similarly, people becoming unhealthy can have a positive effect on GDP, as revenue from associated healthcare boosts growth. Similarly, the extraction of oil and gas pushes GDP up while pushing us closer to the precipice of climate breakdown. Not only does GDP not account for the environmental damage that is done in that process, for example, the pollution or the deforestation or whatever, but it also offers no systematic account of the distribution of income, who is benefiting from the money that might be created. It is entirely possible for average GDP to be rising, even as a significant proportion of the population find themselves worse off. So essentially, we are simply not measuring what matters. And this is not a new observation. As long ago as 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was making exactly that case during his presidential campaign, when he famously said, GDP measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. But if we're not measuring what makes life worthwhile, then it makes it that much harder to muster the urgency to take action to protect and to nurture them. As usual, Greta Thunberg nailed it when she addressed world leaders at the UN Climate Summit a few years ago, when she said, "We are in the beginning of mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth." So you will no doubt be pleased to hear, and I know you will know, that there are many alternative indicators and models for how to measure well-being and success in the economy. Some aim to account more directly for subjective well-being, for example, by measuring self-reported life satisfaction or happiness. Others try to reflect more accurately the state of our natural assets by developing adjusted monetary and non-monetary measures of so-called inclusive wealth. And some of these ideas are being put into practice. New Zealand, for example, has a well-being budget, which looks at spending on the basis of a project's contribution to the well-being of the population, and they measure that through 4 different lenses: human capital, social capital, natural capital, and financial and physical capital. Or there's something called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. It's a recently established collaboration of 5 national and regional governments working to share expertise and advance a shared ambition to build well-being economies, which recognise that economic development in the 21st century means delivering ecological as well as human well-being. So I started off by suggesting that one of the problems is that we can't imagine what the alternative to business as usual economics would actually look like. And those initiatives, the Wellbeing Government's Partnership and the New Zealand Wellbeing Budget, are part of the answer. The alternative to an obsession with growth is widespread cultural, social and political transformation. High-income nations can maintain economic stability, they can invest in innovation and achieve strong social outcomes without the need for additional growth. And we can introduce policies that will reduce inequality, guarantee living wages, shorten the working week, and ensure access to healthcare, education and other essential services. Politics is essentially about choices, making choices. We can choose, if we wish to invest in clean, abundant, homegrown, renewable energy instead of extracting more damaging fossil fuels. We can choose, if we want to levy serious windfall taxes on the energy companies. In the UK, they are due to make 170 billion in excess profits over the next 2 years alone. And yet we have a government in the UK that is refusing to tax them at a commensurate level. We can choose to tackle what I would say is the obscene wealth of the richest. Earlier this year, Oxfam revealed that the wealth of billionaires who've made their money in food and energy has grown by over $450 billion over the past 2 years due to the soaring prices that we've seen. If we share the yields of our economy more fairly, then we can certainly ensure good lives for all those who need it without plundering the planet for more. I wanted to just show one of my favourite cartoons, which has a professor in front of a whiteboard on which he's written all of the advantages of shifting to a zero carbon society and a zero carbon economy. So you've got less pollution, you've got cleaner air, you've got fewer cars, better public transport, children playing in the streets again, locally grown affordable food, warmer homes. And then there's a student who's got a speech bubble coming out of their mouth saying, but what if climate change is a hoax and we've created a better world for no reason? You know, there is the potential here to build that better world if we choose to do so. So by way of conclusion, I would simply reflect the fact that we get told time and time again that things can't be changed. I have been told that time and time again, that this is just the way things are. But you know, we've all just lived through that terrible pandemic, the COVID pandemic. Yet what we saw in the early phases of that COVID pandemic showed the lie when people say that things can't change. That COVID pandemic told us, briefly at least, a different story. That things are possible, that anything is possible if the political will exists. Because it turns out that if they choose to do so, governments can intervene on behalf of the people. They can, and in the UK they did, house the homeless. There was a directive that went round to all local authorities with some money attached saying, get the homeless off the streets. And local authorities did it because the finance was there, because the government had chosen to do that. They can write off billions in debt from our National Health Service. That National Health Service had been suffering under 13 billion of debt for years. Many of us have been calling for it to be written off. It never was until the COVID pandemic, overnight, almost without any kind of comment about it, it was written off. And governments can, if they choose to, put health and well-being above profit and growth. And now we need those changes to be made on an everyday basis, not just making it an extraordinary occurrence. We need to expand our imaginations to a world where we don't treat people or our living planet as expendable. Time is running out in the race for the future, but with a little more imagination, we can win that race and we can transform our lives for the better. I started by reading my own letter to the earth from this book, and I wanted to close by reading a poem by the inspirational US environmentalist and writer Joanna Macy. And it's a poem called Active Hope, and it is on page 137, which I now have. Active hope is not wishful thinking. Active hope is not waiting to be rescued by the Lone Ranger or by some saviour. Active hope is waking up to the beauty of life, on whose behalf we can act. We belong to this world. The web of life is calling us forth at this time. We've come a long way and we're here to play our part. With active hope, we realise that there are adventures in store, strengths to discover, comrades to link arms with. Active hope is a readiness to engage. Active hope is readiness to discover the strengths in ourselves and in others, a readiness to discover the reasons for hope and the occasions for love, a readiness to discover the size and strength of our hearts, our quickness of mind, our steadiness of purpose, our own authority, our love for life, the liveliness of our curiosity, the unsuspected deep well of patience and diligence, the keenness of our senses, and our capacity to lead. None of these can be discovered in an armchair or without risk. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, and some very hard words, hard things to hear, and hard things to digest. And then what we're always encouraging our students to look at, and the IB really has an important focus on, particularly in a lot of the projects, is about, if that's what we've heard, then what? What next? What's the action that comes from those words? So I think for me that's the challenge for tonight. That's a challenge for us as a community that we need to take forward and continue to engage with as a community. So really appreciate you being here tonight to challenge us in that way, and I would argue it's only worth coming out tonight if there is a what next, if there is an action that follows on from tonight's words. The first action is to present to you with a small gift, just to say thank you. We have this locally brewed beer, and thank you so much for coming out again and sort of sponsoring our speaker series with your homebrew, local brewed and local ingredients that come from nearby. So
lovely. I've tried some and it's amazing, so thank you.
So just to take that.
Thank you very much.
And the next immediate, what next, is some questions.
Questions, so we'll take questions. I'll select the people for the questions, and I think it's interesting that what Mrs. Lucas was saying there. Those who were here for Herman von Rompuy, he also spoke about hope, and Caroline finished off talking about hope. So there's a connection there. So the first question, we'll have one over there from the Brewers, I think.
Thank you so much for the talk, and
John, maybe it's easy if you come to the microphone. It'll come across.
Well, actually, I had two pressing questions, but the first one I was interested in is saying, you mentioned that there's a trajectory ongoing in terms of climate change, and there's also a trajectory ongoing in terms of economic growth, and somehow, well, I think we know the human action impacts climate, and the idea that we're going to double everything every 24 years. So I'm wondering, in how far those trajectories are. So it seems to me like the climate and the resources we have available are going to be limiting economic growth at some point. At the same time, the current economic growth, I think many people are mentioning that this current economic growth is not sustainable for the climate. But what would happen? Has there been a model in terms of at what time will economic growth kind of crash simply because of lack of resources? There's too many people on the planet. At what point does that start crashing? And in how far, let's say, further or ahead of climate crashing is that? But I think it's a bit of.
Do you want to die by being shot or being run over by a car? It's kind of what it feels like the question is. Yeah, thank you. No, it's a good question. I mean, obviously there are models, but they're all very uncertain because there are so many unknowns in terms of how much efficiency we will actually be able to put into the system, and what role technology will take. And I've been a little bit hard on technology, and of course I recognise that technology is going to be massively important, and there are technologies that will mean that we can use fewer resources and yet still have economic development. I suppose what I'm warning about is that so often in political debates at the moment, whenever those of us are saying, we need to be reducing our emissions much faster now, the answer tends to be, well, we're going to make sure we're going to have some kind of carbon capture and storage or some kind of aerosols in the atmosphere that will mean that we don't have to take action now, so don't worry about it. So that's what I'm concerned about. In terms of whether or not we are going to basically exceed and go through those other planetary boundaries, whether that's in terms of deforestation, or if it's in terms of running out of basic core minerals or whatever. I mean, there's a fantastic book by Kate Rayworth called Donut Economics, which I would warmly recommend if people don't know it, which absolutely looks at a range of different scenarios when it comes to overshooting the kind of the key planetary boundaries that are so necessary to life on Earth. And I can't tell you whether or not we're going to exceed those before we fry the planet through climate change. And so much of it is connected, of course, as well, because lots of the environmental problems like deforestation are also driving the climate crisis, but ditto, so many of the solutions to reducing emissions take us back into land use and take us back into so many of the environmental questions as well. So that's quite a long way of saying I haven't seen an answer as to which is going to happen first, but I guess my concern is that with climate change in particular, there are so many tipping points, unknown points, that we don't quite know when we have done the thing that is going to trigger a spiral of warming that we can't stop. So, for example, we know that we are, as a result of emissions, the ice is melting in the Arctic, let's say. That means that far greater areas of dark ocean are exposed, which in turn is then absorbing more of the emissions, and so more of the sun's heat. And we don't know how quickly those can tip into a lack of control. So I suppose for me personally, the climate one is the one that scares me more, just because I think those tipping points are just so unknown until we've passed them.
Next question over there, Ranulfo.
Hi, my name is Ranulfo. I'm Brazilian. I was wondering, how about taxes and sanctions do you see for import of goods from Amazonas in Brazil? All these big
I'm going to give you this. I'm so sorry because I can't quite hear you, and maybe others can't either.
I wrote it here, not to use it. Yes, I was wondering, how do you see, and if you have any opinion about imposing taxes and or sanctions regarding the import of woods from the Amazons in Brazil that are used by big Western corporations? How do you see them?
Yes, so what we do about the fact that so much of the consumption that we're doing in the richer world is dependent on resources coming from places like the Amazon in Brazil and the damage that that's doing. I mean, one of the pieces of work that I've been involved in, both in the European Parliament actually, but also at Westminster, has been trying to get illegal logging out of supply chains. And that is massively difficult because you might be able to regulate the first person who puts the timber onto the market, or rather the last person, the person that's most direct to the consumer, but tracking that right back along the supply chain is massively difficult. But I mean, I would say that where we can do it, then prohibition needs to be there. I mean, taxing it, raising money from it is going to be a disincentive, but not enough, I would argue. So where there are clearly behaviours happening that are massively damaging, as I would suggest illegal logging would be, then I would just like to say we should have laws that just get that out of the supply chain completely. I would also say that massively important is having the relationship with people in the Amazon, with indigenous peoples and peoples who are represented, so that we know what they want too. Because I know that sometimes it's very easy to ban things in the West. I'm thinking about child labour, for example, a different issue, but I know that there's been big discussions about that. But if you just simply ban it and you don't work with companies in poorer countries to enable them to have the finance and pay more for your products in the first place, which would then mean you didn't have to have child labour. So sometimes it can be more complicated than simply bans, but with something like illegal logging, with something that is just simply destroying the environment at the rate that it is, then I think we should be really cracking down as hard as we can on measures that will prohibit that throughout the supply chain.
A question in the back there, please.
So I had a question about the power of marketing. And marketing is a field that I guess has boomed in the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years, or probably a lot earlier, but it really came into force with MBAs and with all of this so-called science of marketing and economics. And if marketing has been so powerful in terms of inducing people to consume more, you know, the iPhones and the clothes and the traveling and you know, all the stuff that marketing induces us to consume, is there some sort of theory or study going on about anti-marketing? How can we teach the young people with tools as powerful as marketing has been? You know, we have to be, we got to give credit to the marketing industry for what they've done.
Yeah.
Can we market good stuff?
Yeah.
So that kids, and I'm thinking of the 18-year-olds or the 15-year-olds, so that kids want to consume stuff, you know, let them consume, whatever, but that they consume stuff that actually goes into the opposite direction.
I think that's a great question. And yes, we can. And yes, it is already happening. And there's also, just today I was reading in the paper, the kind of the subversion of existing marketing too. There's an organization called Badvertising, rather than advertising. And what they've just been doing around Europe is putting up, you know, kind of rogue posters in big sites across Europe. So, for example, it looks, when you first look at the advert, as if it's from Ryanair, but actually you see that what they've written is Ruinair, and it tells you to go and visit sort of islands that are completely covered in plastic, and when you look again a bit closer, the air hostesses are wearing masks, you know, sort of smoke masks and so forth. Anyway, so we can partly subvert what's already out there, and some of that's done in quite funny and appealing ways. But certainly, I think you're right that and already, I mean, young people are just doing so many amazing things already. I mean, there is already, you know, trends around vintage clothing and using clothing and sharing clothing and doing all of that. You know, there are mobile phones you can buy out there that are far less, that are used far more reusable components and will last much longer, and you can actually upgrade them. It's not like the Apple ones where you can't actually, you know, once it's at the end of its life or its batteries run out, then you can't take it anywhere to repair it. So I think we need that advertising, but we also need the other part of the economy, which is the repair economy. And again, it's happening now. It's quite exciting that you'll see sort of places where you can go along and have a coffee and take your toaster or your bicycle or whatever it is and get it repaired. So suddenly this built-in obsolescence, which has been such a powerful marketing ploy to mean that you can't repair things and you have to chuck them out because either you simply can't repair them or it just costs so much to repair them. So if we had a proper circular economy, if we made rules, it's not difficult. It comes back to what I was saying earlier about political choices. You know, there can be standards that say that, first of all, that only a certain amount of new virgin produce can be in products that are on sale now, or you can make rules that would say that any products on sale now needs to be able to be broken down into its constituent parts so they can be repaired. You know, it's not rocket science. I think that's what makes me so furious, that there is a perfect kind of potential industry here doing good stuff, and yet somehow we haven't managed to turn that vicious circle into the virtuous circle in a scaled up way, in a way that is sufficiently fast and large.
Question there, Matt?
Yes, hello, good evening. First of all, thank you for the speech.
Thank you.
The only question that I would have throughout the entire presentation was the idea of waiting for new solutions. Whilst my question is very simple, knowing that in the past we have, for example, hydrogen fuel as a possible alternative, we have nuclear power as a possible alternative that are producing much less wastes in comparison to fossil fuels. Why aren't we looking for those alternatives that are already there and that are well understood rather than maybe waiting for something new to appear?
Wow, we could get into a good discussion about that. On nuclear, I mean, to take your particular examples before I take your wider question, on nuclear, I would argue that it is so slow to build nuclear power stations, and it's so costly that why would we invest that and wait for that amount of time when we know that we could be scaling up renewables so much faster, and indeed the poor cousin in this whole debate, which is around energy saving, energy efficiency. You know, one of the things we've been begging, certainly in Britain, I don't know what it's like here, but we've been begging the government to do there is to properly set out a home insulation program, which means that when people are heating their homes, it's not just all going out of the windows and the doors and the walls, but is actually keeping people warm. So it feels to me that appropriate technologies, absolutely, you're right, and maybe we might differ on whether or not nuclear is one of them, but the broader point you make is absolutely spot on. It is about saying, why don't we use what we know already works? So, for example, we could be doing so much more when it comes to tidal energy. I'm speaking from a British perspective, but when you look at the UK, you know, we are one of the best placed countries in the world for tidal. You know, why aren't we doing floating wind turbines out at sea, which can go to places that the permanent ones can't? Hydrogen, you're absolutely right again, but let's make sure it's green hydrogen. My worry is that so often we come across sort of false alternatives because they are being put forward by the fossil fuel companies who basically don't want to change business as usual. And so they're going to try to persuade us that sort of grey hydrogen, in other words, still using fossil fuels to create it, is the way forward. And we need to make sure that we don't lock ourselves into another damaging technology, and we do the good stuff. But essentially, you're right, there are plenty of good technologies out there. They need to be supported more. I mean, again, I'm sorry, I'm coming from a very UK perspective, but one of the big frustrations has been just recently that we've got a government now that thinks fracking is wonderful. Fracking is not wonderful, and it certainly won't get our prices down. In the UK just now, gas is 9 times more expensive than renewables. So why would you be fracking for more gas rather than going down the renewable route? But it's I can't remember where I was going to go with that now, sorry. Yes, fracking, the government's supporting fracking, but it also had a ban on onshore wind. You know, this is just not making any sense at all. So there are political choices going on there. I think we should be looking at the role the fossil fuel industry plays in lobbying governments, in giving finance to our politicians. We haven't got onto this subject yet, but it feels to me that if we're going to be serious about this agenda, we need to recognise there are some really big vested interests who don't want us to make progress on this agenda, and therefore things like really cleaning up the whole issue of financial donations to political parties and making that far more transparent is going to be really important, because I think a lot of these decisions are being made because essentially big fossil fuel companies have been paying politicians to do what they want.
Question over there.
Yeah, you talked a lot about government and politicians, and when we are here and the young people are listening and they must say, okay, what can we do? They are just so powerful. We want change, but who are we to make them? And you just mentioned the financial behind all of that, the finances. So it's like a vicious circle. Politicians get their money from those companies.
The reason I read out the poem at the end was because I wanted to try to get over the idea, to challenge a little bit, and I hope I haven't given the impression that we can't do anything. Of course we can do anything, and young people, I have to say, have been in the forefront of doing stuff. I mean, the actions that the Friday for Future Friday, anyway, you know what I mean, the young people's climate groups have been extraordinary at putting climate change at the top of the agenda. And my experience is certainly that young people are challenging the older generation all the time to make better decisions. And I think all of us can make that difference. And I was speaking earlier to some of the students here about how a school or a college can just be a beacon of best practice, and how, because it's sort of a microcosm of a local area or of a community, you know, the work that you can do to be lobbying your student councils and your teachers and whoever else to make sure that in a place like this, that the energy is renewable energy, that you're signed up to a green energy company, that that the waste is recycled, that you're doing everything that you possibly can be in the places that you are, and that can be hugely powerful, because then you can demonstrate the power of the possible, and then you can go and take that and build on it more widely. You can be lobbying your representatives at the local council level, at a national council level. You can stand yourself, you can stand for student council, you can stand when you get a bit older for election too. So I would just say that this moment is a moment of such consequence, and there is always stuff we can do. young people in particular, but also older people with our pensions. You know, where are our pensions being invested? Why aren't we shifting those into more ecological areas? Where's our money being invested? Some of the banks are some of the worst culprits in terms of continuing to fund fossil fuels. So I think it is about taking that action and recognizing that each bit that we do adds up to a whole.
A question there, Wolf?
Can I ask a really terrible question?
My heart is sinking. What's he going to say?
This is something I struggle with as an educator. So I came across that MIT projection about a year ago, and it really struck me. You know, one of the interesting things about that projection is they didn't even take climate change into account. They had no idea at that time. So just based on all the other factors, they're thinking of, excuse me, possibility for like a total social breakdown sometime in the 2030s as at the earliest. And that's not that far from here. And I wonder sometimes, should we as educators not also be preparing the next generation for the possibility that maybe we don't get the safer world? Meaning, what do we do? How do we live in that landscape? Should we be teaching, you know, sustainable practices on a very small level about how to, you know, insulate a very small family? Now, I come from Alaska, and you know, there's a lot of crazy people out there who try to live on their own out in the bush, and so I think about that sort of thing, survivalist types. And I have to admit that, you know, of course, rubs up a little bit off when you grow up in that environment. But do we also have some kind of responsibility for, it's not a plan, but what happens if plan A doesn't work? Because it might not.
I mean, I think that is an extraordinarily powerful question. And I think my answer to it would be that, yes, educators do have a role in doing that. And I guess I would say that the way that you frame that, hopefully, is not one that kind of causes people to despair. That's the risk of that, isn't it? That people just begin to think that it's not, you know, that it's not worth trying to prevent what could happen. But it feels to me that so many of the skills that you would be talking about that are going to be necessary for a world in which we are adapting and doing our best to adapt, at least, to a world of let's say, very high temperatures or you know, some kind of breakdown, the behaviours and the skills that you're going to need are going to be ones that are going to be pretty valuable, even if we don't get to that stage. So I'm thinking of, for example, growing more of our own food, or you know, making more of our own clothes, or whatever it is. Just being more resilient. That I think is the key, and resilience is going to be so important, whichever of these scenarios that we're looking at. And I hope and I think that it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. I mean, I'm really aware this is a Friday evening. You don't want to come out and just be utterly depressed. But it feels to me that there are some wonderful ways of people coming together and learning this stuff. And there's also some fantastic intergenerational opportunities where older people who might well have kind of come through the war and know a bit more about make, do and mend and what they used to do and can share some of that stuff. Or people who've got big gardens and aren't fit enough now to be gardening them, can be sharing that with younger people and showing them, you know, how to care for the plants and the things that we're going to need for the future. So I guess I'm saying that I agree with you that there is that preparation and those behaviours and skills that need to be taught. But I don't think it has to be framed in an apocalyptic way. And I think it would be pretty unhelpful if it were. If it could be more about the value of community and coming together to share what we already know and building that resilience because it's a great thing to do and it can be a fun thing to do, that I think might be a more effective way forward.
Okay, we have time for one more question. The scientist, Mrs. Topley.
Okay, I'm actually going to say something positive, completely positive. So last Sunday, I live in Lamb, I went to a presentation about how beavers have been introduced into Lamb and how much good they've done to the community. That they have made the very hot summer that we've had here, they have kept all the water with their dams, it has kept everything going. There's been 117 new bird species, 4 different types of amphibians, and I'm just quoting from the top of my head because obviously the thing. So I thought I would say something positive.
And I just to say, in my garden, I do have a beaver. He does build dams, doesn't she? I haven't seen him. I have a camera. I haven't got him on my camera yet. I have an infrared camera, but he's not there. But I thought I'd end with that. And there's a really positive bit about, I can say about Belgium, is Belgium does have in their environmental government 2 branches. They don't just have agriculture, they also have nature too. And they fight continually. So what else can I tell you? Solvay, sadly I don't live off Solvay land, because Solvay now has banned all hunting from this year. So there's no more hunting. So, positive bit.
I mean, I love that. Thank you, Julia. And the thing is, just to kind of continue that positive theme, everything that we need to do, there are already communities around the world doing it. I mean, there's a fantastic example that you've just given. Rewilding is happening all over the world, where people are going back to the land and cultivating it in a different way that does put natural processes and wildlife and so forth at its heart. That is already happening. And there are wonderful communities coming together to save energy, to have all kinds of new local food initiatives, more affordable, more nutritious and organic food. There is stuff happening everywhere in the world. What we need to do is to take those best examples and scale them up and make them the norm, not the exception. So I would just come back to what I said at the beginning, really, which is that the frustration around all of this is not that we don't know what to do, or that we can't do it, or we don't have the money to do it, or we don't have the technology to do it. We have everything that we need to do it, except the political will to do it at the speed and the scale that the crisis demands. And I suppose that is what frustrates me so much. So yes, let's celebrate all of those wonderful examples. And let's celebrate too, if I can, just one thing that I've managed to do in the British Parliament, hopefully more than one thing, but actually maybe not. But anyway, the thing I've managed to do was around GCSE in natural history. GCSEs are the exams, the public exams you take at age 16. And I've been arguing for so long that it should be possible to make sure that in the curriculum we have space for young people, not just to learn the sciences, but to have much more of an empirical exposure into nature, and to get the mud under their fingernails, and to smell the fungi, and to really get to be in countryside and be intimate with it. I was so struck by a book by Richard Louv called Last Child in the Wood, where he says, we won't protect what we don't love, and we won't love what we don't know. Yeah. And that feels to me such an important part of going back to what educators can do. Let's make sure that we are giving space in these incredibly busy curriculi for that love of nature, which is so good on a mental health basis. It's so good for people's enjoyment, but it's so good, I believe, too, for the future of our species and every other species too.
Let us celebrate Caroline. Let us thank her for what we have learned from her tonight, and let us continue our conversation over a glass of something or among ourselves. Thank you so much, Caroline, for being with us. Thank you also for being with us, and let us continue. There is hope, but we have to do it. We all have to do it. Thank you.